All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at atelophobia, the fear of imperfection.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this is something that probably a lot of us can relate to
Yeah.
on some level.
Yeah.
Whether we're getting ready for a big presentation at work
Mm-hmm.
or dealing with a really demanding boss,
Yeah.
or even if you're just like me and interested in just all the kind of like weird things that our brains do.
Yeah, yeah.
I think this is going to be a really fascinating deep dive. We've got a great article from Very Well Mind
Okay.
that we're going to be using as our guide.
Cool.
And Very Well Mind is a really good resource for mental health information.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in good hands. So when we think about atelophobia,
Yeah.
I think most people would say, well, who isn't afraid of messing up?
Right. Like, who isn't a little bit afraid of making a mistake?
Exactly.
But atelophobia is not that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to dig into. Like, what's the difference between like that
Hmm.
normal feeling of like, I don't want to screw this up,
Right.
and like a full-blown phobia?
So I think the difference really is the intensity and the
Yeah.
impact.
Okay.
So imagine that even the thought of making a mistake sends you into the spiral of panic. Your heart starts racing.
Mhm.
You're getting shallow breaths. Maybe you're feeling nauseous, dizzy.
Yeah.
That's your body going into that fight or flight response.
Right.
Even though the threat is just this possibility of making a mistake.
Yeah.
And because of that intensity and that fear, people with atelophobia, they set these really, really high standards for themselves.
Yeah.
They become hypercritical of everything they do.
Mhm.
It's hard to accept feedback even when it's meant to be constructive because any suggestion feels like an attack.
Yeah. So it's almost like
Mm-hmm.
the fear itself is creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Like they're so afraid of making a mistake that
Yeah.
it actually ends up.
And what's important to realize is that it's not just like in their head, right?
Yeah.
The article talks about very real physical symptoms of this.
Uh-huh.
So like sweating and trembling and chills, these are all very real physical manifestations of the
Wow.
body's anxiety response.
Right.
And it's important to remember that we're not just talking about someone who's a bit of a perfectionist.
Yeah.
We're talking about a very real, very impactful mental health condition.
And so that makes me wonder, like, what causes this?
Right.
Is it something that like people are born with,
Yeah.
or is it something that happens
Right.
because of things that happen to them?
Well, like a lot of mental health conditions, it's probably a mix.
Okay.
The article talks about past traumas as being a really big factor.
Okay.
So let's say you're a kid and you made some mistake and you had a really harsh consequence for it.
Okay.
Your brain might overcorrect and develop this intense fear of making mistakes just to avoid
Oh.
ever feeling that way again.
So it's almost like a protection mechanism.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's past trauma.
Mhm.
So what about upbringing? Does that play a role?
Upbringing can definitely be a big factor. Imagine growing up in a home where perfection was the expectation,
Right.
that anything less than perfect was met with criticism or disapproval.
Okay.
And in that environment, that fear of imperfection might become a learned response as a way to secure love and acceptance.
Right. That makes me think of like the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Right, like how much of this is pre-wired versus shaped by our experiences.
Right. Exactly.
And the article brings up a really interesting point about genetics.
Okay.
There's some research that suggests that phobias, including this one, can run in families.
Really?
So there might be a genetic predisposition to developing anxiety disorders,
Mm-hmm.
but then the way that anxiety shows up,
Right.
whether it's social anxiety or fear of spiders or atelophobia,
Yeah, yeah.
that might be shaped by the environment.
So it's like you might be born with a blueprint for anxiety,
Right.
but then the way that anxiety manifests depends on your experiences.
And that brings up another interesting point,
Yeah.
which is that sometimes this fear isn't necessarily about you as an individual,
Mhm.
but it's about a reaction to a toxic situation.
So what do you mean by like a toxic situation?
So imagine a workplace
Okay.
where any mistake, no matter how small, is met with like public humiliation or threats.
Oh, wow.
Or imagine a family dynamic where you only receive love and acceptance if you're performing perfectly.
Right.
In these cases, that fear of imperfection isn't irrational.
Yeah.
It's a completely understandable response to an environment that's not good for you.
So it's like your body is like trying to like protect you,
Exactly.
but it's not like a physical threat. It's like an emotional or a psychological.
It's an environmental threat.
Yeah.
So that's a really important distinction because
Right.
it shifts the blame away from the individual
Yeah.
to the situation,
Okay.
which can be helpful.
That's fascinating. So we've talked a lot about like what it is and
Right.
kind of what causes it.
Mm-hmm.
Is this like an official mental illness?
Yes, it is. The article says Atelophobia is classified as a specific phobia,
Okay.
and that's part of the family of anxiety disorders.
Okay.
So it's not just a personality quirk.
Right.
It's a very real diagnosable condition that impacts people's lives.
That's so interesting because I feel like,
Mhm.
we live in a culture that really glorifies perfectionism.
Right, hustle culture, yeah.
Yeah, like if you're not
Mhm.
killing yourself
Yeah.
to be perfect,
Totally.
then you're not trying hard enough.
Yeah, and so it can be really easy to dismiss those intense feelings as just that ambition,
Yeah.
but I think realizing this is an actual mental health condition
Yeah.
helps
To
to...
validate it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's actually a connection here to other mental health conditions, particularly obsessive compulsive disorder,
OCD.
OCD,
Yeah.
and also obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
OCPD.
OCPD, yeah.
Okay.
So tell me more about that.
Yeah. I'm super curious about this.
So atelophobia can exist on its own,
Okay.
but it can also be a part of these other conditions.
Okay.
So someone with OCD, they might be driven by this overwhelming need for order and symmetry.
Right.
And so any imperfection in their environment could trigger that intense anxiety
Right.
and maybe even drive them to do things over and over to
Wow.
try to get rid of the imperfections.
So it's almost like the fear isn't just about the mistake.
Right.
It's about the fact that it disrupts their need for order.
It disrupts that sense of control.
Right, right.
Now, OCPD is a little different.
Okay.
So someone with OCPD, they may have this really strong need for control and perfection in all areas of their life.
Okay.
And for them, the fear of imperfection is tied to their sense of self-worth
Okay.
and their need to maintain this perfect image.
So for them, the fear is almost like it's like a threat to their
Yeah, I know.
identity or something.
It really can be, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And this connection with the personality disorders is another reason why getting an actual diagnosis is so important.
Right.
It's not about putting a label on someone.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding what's going on and
Right.
tailoring the treatment accordingly.
So this brings up another question for me, which is, what's the difference between atelophobia and just being a perfectionist?
Right. That's a good question because there is definitely some overlap.
Yeah, they feel very similar.
Right, they do. They do. And the article actually has a table that breaks down the differences.
Okay.
And I think a big takeaway is that although both involve this strong desire for flawlessness, the motivation is different.
So it's not just that you want things to be perfect.
Right.
It's the reason behind it.
Exactly. So with perfectionism, you have this drive for excellence. You want to achieve a high standard. And yeah, that can be stressful sometimes.
Right.
But it's not necessarily rooted in fear.
Okay.
Whereas with atelophobia, the driver is this deep, paralyzing fear
Okay.
of making a mistake,
Gotcha.
of being seen as inadequate.
So like perfectionism is like, I want this to be the best it can be.
Right.
And atelophobia is like, oh my God, what if it's not perfect? I'm a failure.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, and it's that fear that can be really debilitating.
Mm-hmm.
It can lead to people avoiding things.
Yeah.
And it can really interfere with their everyday life.
Right.
Perfectionism, even when it causes problems, it's usually not as severe or all-consuming as this.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction because I think a lot of people probably get those two mixed up.
Right.
So I think understanding like the difference in the motivation is really key to understanding this whole atelophobia thing.
And so this brings up a really important question for me. Okay.
Which is that. Let's say someone's listening to this and thinking, hey, this sounds familiar.
Yeah.
What can they do about it?
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Like, what's the hope for somebody who's dealing with this?
That's the good news.
Okay.
There are actually a lot of effective treatments and coping strategies out there.
Okay, great.
The article specifically mentions professional help, therapies like exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy.
CBT.
CBT, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Those can be really, really powerful.
So can you explain, like, how those work
Yeah.
for atelophobia specifically?
So exposure therapy is about kind of gradually and safely confronting the thing that you're afraid of.
Okay.
So in the case of Atelophobia, it might involve helping someone slowly get used to making mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
talking about them, accepting them.
Right.
The idea is to slowly desensitize yourself to that fear response
So it's like dipping your toe in the pool.
before jumping all the way in.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, CBT, that focuses on changing those negative thought patterns
Yeah.
and beliefs that are contributing to the phobia.
Right.
So let's say someone with atelophobia has this thought, if I make one mistake, nobody will love me anymore.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's a really common thought pattern.
Okay.
So CBT would help them challenge that thought
Okay.
and replace it with a more balanced perspective. Something like, my worth as a human being isn't tied to being perfect. People who really care about me are going to love me no matter what.
Yeah.
So it's about rewiring those thought patterns that are causing the fear.
So you're basically like teaching them to think differently about it.
To think more realistically about
Yeah.
it. And,
Yeah.
and then there's mindfulness too, which I think is so important for this.
Okay.
So techniques like grounding
Mm-hmm.
can be so helpful for interrupting those spiraling anxiety loops that we see so often with this phobia. By focusing on the present moment, you can really break free from that grip of fearful thoughts.
It's like you're pushing the pause button on that like movie in your mind.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Okay.
So in addition to the professional help,
Hmm.
the article also gives some practical tips
Okay, great.
that people can start using right now.
I like actionable advice.
I do too.
So let's hear it.
So one thing they suggest is to start small. Purposely make tiny, inconsequential mistakes.
Okay.
So mispronounce a word on purpose. Wear mismatched socks. Order the wrong thing at a restaurant.
Okay.
The point is to gently nudge yourself outside your comfort zone and realize that the world doesn't end
Right.
when you're not perfect.
So it's kind of like showing your fear that it doesn't have control over you.
Exactly. Another good one is to build a supportive network of people who
nice.
love and accept you unconditionally.
Right.
Surround yourself with people who value you for who you are, flaws and all. That can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, so what if that fear is tied to like a specific
Mm.
situation, like that toxic workplace we
Right.
were talking about?
In those cases, the advice is very clear. You need to consider exiting that environment.
Wow.
Sometimes the best thing you can do for your mental health is to just remove yourself
Yeah,
from the source of the problem.
that's really powerful. So this has been a really great conversation so far.
It has been fascinating.
We've covered so much ground. We've talked about what atelophobia is.
Yeah.
We've talked about the causes, the
Mhm.
symptoms,
Yeah.
the connection to OCD and OCPD.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
This deep dive has revealed so much about how our thoughts and feelings and our physical responses are all intertwined.
Mhm.
It reminds us that fear is a part of being human,
Right.
but we don't have to let it control us.
And that's really the big takeaway I'm getting from this,
Yeah.
is that it's not about eliminating fear.
Right.
It's about understanding it and managing it.
So that it doesn't take over our lives.
And this brings us to a crucial point,
Okay.
which is understanding the difference between striving for excellence
Okay.
and being paralyzed by the fear of imperfection.
Right.
And I think that's what we've been talking about. Like there's
Mhm.
this spectrum, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Like you can have like that healthy drive to be your best,
Yeah.
to always be improving.
Yeah.
But then on the other end of that is this fear of,
Right. The fear of making even the smallest mistake.
yeah.
What-
And that's where perfectionism
Mhm.
can become a problem.
Exactly. It stops being a motivator and starts being a source of stress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a point that the article really emphasized. It's
Yeah.
like, it's not just wanting to put your best foot forward.
Mhm.
It's like being terrified of what will happen if
Mhm.
you're not perfect.
And that fear can be so powerful
Yeah.
that it stops people from even trying things
Right.
that they might be really good at. It's almost like they're trapped
Is
in this prison of perfectionism where
Yeah.
they're too afraid to actually,
right, too afraid to step outside and risk making a mistake.
yeah,
And it breaks my heart when I see that.
yeah, it's sad.
It's really sad. But, talking about it helps. It raises awareness.
Right,
It encourages people to reach out for help.
right,
And that's why we do the show.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the article did a really good job
Mm.
of like giving hope to people.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't just all doom and gloom.
Right.
It was like, here's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what you can do about it.
Totally.
And I think one of the most important things,
Right.
whether you struggle with atelophobia or not,
Hmm.
is to really develop self-compassion.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like giving yourself permission
Yes.
to be human,
Exactly.
to make mistakes, to
Mhm.
learn and grow
Yeah.
without this pressure to be perfect all the time.
And we all make mistakes.
Yeah, we do.
It's part of the learning process.
Right.
And instead of beating ourselves up when we mess up,
Yeah.
we could choose to see them as opportunities to grow.
Right. Like that saying, we learn more from our failures than we do our successes.
That's right.
But it's so hard to embrace that when you're in the middle of all that fear.
It is, but it's possible.
Yeah.
And, I think if we can shift our focus from achieving some perfect image to actually taking care of ourselves and accepting ourselves for who we are,
Right.
we can start to break free.
You know what's really interesting about this whole conversation
Mm-hmm.
is that we started talking about like a fear of imperfection,
Right.
but now we're talking about like self-compassion,
Mm-hmm.
resilience,
Right.
the learning process.
It's all connected.
It's all connected.
There's like this one little thread in
Mhm.
this giant tapestry.
It is.
So I think a question for our listeners would be,
What is your relationship?
how
do you feel about mistakes and imperfections?
do you see them as these catastrophic events that you have to avoid at all costs?
Right.
Or are you able to see them as these valuable opportunities
Yeah.
to learn and grow?
Because, like the article said,
Mhm.
mistakes are a part of life.
It's what makes us human.
Right. We're all going to mess up.
Yeah.
We're all going to have those moments where we don't meet our own expectations
right.
or other people's expectations.
That's legal.
And that's okay.
It is.
But there's a difference between knowing that
Yeah,
and feeling it.
for sure.
So here's a little challenge for you.
Okay.
What's one small mistake you could intentionally make today
Ooh, I like this.
to challenge your fear of being imperfect?
It sounds silly,
Yeah.
but those little acts of rebellion can be really powerful.
Yeah. It's like taking back your power.
Totally.
So maybe you try a new recipe,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that there's a chance you might burn it.
Yeah.
Or you send an email without like proofreading it a million times.
You're right. Or you could wear 2 different socks
Oh, yeah. I like that one.
just to shake things up a bit.
The point is to let go of that need to control everything
Yes.
and just give yourself permission to be imperfect.
This conversation has been a great starting point,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully it sparks some thoughts for our listeners too, and maybe even raised more questions than it answered.
Because curiosity
Mm-hmm.
is how we grow.
That's right.
So if this topic has resonated with you,
Yeah.
do some more research, check out Very Well Mind and some other mental health websites.
Totally.
And if you feel like you need help,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to reach out to a therapist.
Absolutely.
There's no shame in asking for help.
You're not at all.
And most importantly,
Mm-hmm.
you're not alone in this.
We all have those imperfections that
Yeah.
make us human.
Embrace them.
Yes.
Learn from your mistakes
Mm-hmm.
and keep on exploring.
That's right.
It's like we're all on this journey of
Yeah.
becoming the best versions of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
but we're also terrified of stirring it up.
It's a weird paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, we want to grow and evolve,
Mm-hmm.
but we're so scared of making mistakes along the way.
Right. And that's like the heart of atelophobia, right?
It really is. It's that fear of not being good enough.
Yeah.
That fear of being judged or rejected.
And it can be so paralyzing.
Absolutely. It can prevent people from pursuing their dreams,
Mm-hmm.
from taking risks,
Yeah.
from putting themselves out there.
It's like they're stuck in this
Mhm.
cycle of fear and avoidance.
Exactly. And the more they avoid things,
Yeah.
the stronger that fear becomes.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It really is. And it's so sad because these are often incredibly talented and capable people,
Right.
but they're held back by this intense fear of not being perfect.
And you know what's interesting is that we
Yeah.
live in a culture that kind of reinforces this fear.
Oh, absolutely.
Like we're constantly bombarded with
Hmm.
images of perfection.
Yes. Airbrush models perfect bodies.
Yeah, like success stories that don't show any of the struggles or setbacks.
Right. It's all highlight reels and filtered photos.
And so it's easy to feel like
Yeah.
we're not measuring up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like everyone else has it all figured out.
Right.
And we're the only ones struggling.
And then social media comes along.
Oh, don't even get me started on social media.
Yeah.
It's like a breeding ground for comparison and self-doubt.
Right. Like everyone's presenting this perfect curated version of themselves.
Exactly. And it's so easy to get caught up in that
Yeah.
and start feeling inadequate.
It's like we've developed this collective phobia of imperfection.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
Like as a society, we're terrified of making mistakes.
And of showing any vulnerability. It's like we've forgotten that it's okay to be human.
So how do we change that?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
Like recognizing those unrealistic expectations that we're bombarded with.
And challenging those messages.
Exactly. Like asking ourselves,
Yeah.
is this really attainable? Is this even desirable?
Right.
And then I think it's about shifting our focus from external validation to internal validation.
So like valuing our own efforts.
Yes.
Yes.
And celebrating our own progress.
Even if it's not perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where self-compassion comes in.
Right. Like giving ourselves permission to be imperfect.
To make mistakes.
Yeah.
To learn and grow at our own pace.
Yeah. To not be so hard on ourselves.
Exactly. Because we're all works in progress.
We are.
And that's okay.
It's more than okay.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
It is.
Like imagine a world where we celebrate effort over outcome.
I love that.
Where we view mistakes as opportunities for learning.
Yes. Instead of seeing them as failures.
Right.
That would be amazing.
It would be a much kinder and more supportive world.
Absolutely.
And maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
this deep dive into atelophobia can help us move in that direction.
I hope so.
Because even if you don't struggle with a full-blown phobia, I think we all have those moments where we feel inadequate.
Absolutely. We all have those moments of self-doubt.
Yeah.
Where we compare ourselves to others and come up short.
And it's in those moments that we need to remember to be kind to ourselves.
Exactly. To practice self-compassion.
Yeah.
To remember that we're all worthy of love and acceptance.
Even with all our flaws and imperfections.
Especially with our flaws and imperfections.
Because those are the things that make us unique.
They make us who we are.
And they make life interesting.
They do.
So instead of striving for perfection, maybe we should all strive to be a little more compassionate.
I love that.
A little more understanding. A little more forgiving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of ourselves and of others.
Because at the end of the day, we're all just doing the best we can with what we've got.
And that's enough.
It is. It's true. And sometimes it's those tiny little things, those little acts of rebellion that can be the most freeing, you know.
Yeah, I agree.
It's like you're finally giving yourself permission to be human.
Totally.
To not be perfect and to be okay with that.
And I think that's what we've been talking about this whole time.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance between striving for excellence and accepting that we're not always going to get it right.
We're all perfectly imperfect.
Exactly.
And you know what? This whole conversation about atelophobia, it's got me thinking about how much our culture kind of fuels this fear of imperfection.
Oh, absolutely.
Like we're surrounded by these images of perfection. Airbrush models, success stories that never show the struggles.
It's all about the highlight reel.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to see the behind-the-scenes mess.
And it makes it so hard to feel like you're good enough.
Totally. And then you add social media into the mix.
Oh, yeah. Don't even get me started.
It's like a whole other level of pressure.
Right. Everyone's presenting this perfect, curated version of themselves.
And it's so easy to get caught up in that comparison game.
It's exhausting.
It really is.
So how do we break free?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
I think it starts with being mindful of the messages we're consuming and the messages we're putting out there.
Like, are we celebrating authenticity?
Yeah.
Or are we just contributing to this fake idea of perfection?
And on a personal level, I think it's about being kind to ourselves.
Self-compassion.
Exactly.
Reminding ourselves that our worth doesn't depend on being perfect.
It's about progress, not perfection.
So maybe instead of trying to be flawless, we should all try to be a little more compassionate.
I love that.
A little more understanding, a little more forgiving.
Yes. Of ourselves and of others.
Because in the end, we're all just doing our best.
We are.
And that's enough.
It really is.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into atelophobia.
It's been a great conversation.
It really has.
And I hope our listeners found it helpful.
I hope so, too.
And remember, you're not alone in this.
We all have those moments of self-doubt, and that's okay.
So embrace your imperfections.
Yeah.
Learn from your mistakes.
And keep on exploring.
Thanks for joining us.